Sarah Higgins. I'm the Executive and Artistic Director of Art Papers. I'm joined by Noah Reyes, who's our editorial and outreach coordinator. And we are really excited to start this two-day program of conversations and dialogues around Atlanta's art ecosystems. But we wanted to really begin by kind of calling everyone in to look at some vocabulary together. We talked a lot about, okay, so there's going to be a more formal introduction before the first panel, but I'm going to give you a little preview of that formal introduction. So this series of programs has really been about a year in the making, and we convened a group, a steering committee of arts leaders that met monthly over the course of about 6-7 months, and we had a lot of conversations about what do we want to say, what did we wish people knew that we find that they often don't know, and what urgencies did we want to respond to in the community. And one of the things that came up was that we as arts administrators and as educators and people who are spending our lives entrenched in this space often forget that we're speaking in insider language, that we sometimes take for granted that vocabulary is known or shared. And so this sort of preamble to the series is just a chance for us to go through some ideas and words that are going to reappear throughout. I also want to, before we get started, make everybody aware of the program zine that we created just for this talk series. It's adorable. It was designed by our intern, Monty Lowry, who's also with me running around here with a camera. And it has a program for the day. It has the schedule. It has bios for all of the speakers. It has bios for the organizations and projects they represent. And then it also has a kind of phone book, Yellow Pages style resource guide that we've compiled that features awards, commercial galleries, nonprofit art spaces, art handlers. There's kind of a toolkit of what, and a snapshot of what exists in the art community right now. And so these are free for you to take, but we ask you to only take them if you want to have them. But they're at the front table. So let me get my clicker. So for the crash course, So we wanted to start off by talking about nonprofits and the difference between nonprofits and not-for-profit, which is a term that is often applied to projects that are volunteer-run, that are functioning in a kind of provisional way, and the sort of official categories of nonprofit and 501c3. See, it's about to get really nerdy in here. Because what this entire series of conversations is really focusing on is nonprofit and nonprofit adjacent spaces. And so, and I know that I'm looking out into the crowd and I'm seeing folks that I know a lot of this is going to be very well-known stuff. And so this is meant to be kind of a dialogue and a conversation. I invite y'all to chime in as we move through these terms. But does that sound good?
Yes, because we don't all have that.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, but I also, I'm looking at you here. Because it feels, it's funny, and your front and center is Ann Dennington, who knows more about this than me. And so every time I look up talking about it, I see Ann, and I'm like, there you are. So here's just a quick download of some information about the difference between a nonprofit, or like the designation. It's an IRS tax exempt corporation. So it's a business but it's a nonprofit business as a designation of that business. So it returns its net earnings to its mission. And that's why nonprofits are always talking about their mission, and we're giving you their mission statement. That mission is sort of what the entire business structure is organized around. And it's what you decide, it's how you decide what you spend your money on. So it's restricted to mission-oriented work. And so nonprofits have an obligation to do work only that pertains to their mission. They can't sort of decide that, you know, we're gonna do something completely different. And we'll get into why shortly. But the mission must be for the public good, and that can be defined in a lot of different ways. Obviously, it can be educational, it can be in cultural enrichment, it can be like charity work. And so there's, you know, a broad, we're talking about visual art nonprofits, but there's an extremely broad range of types of nonprofits. The one important restriction is that they can't do political fundraising. Like a nonprofit can't make, for example, donations to a political campaign. And there's high levels of oversight and requirements for transparency. And that we'll get into also in a minute. And so just to kind of like cast a quick contrast on a nonprofit and a for-profit not tax exempt. That tax exemption is, you know, kind of a big deal. And there's also no legal limitations on net earnings or how those net earnings are distributed. So you can, you know, if you have a really stellar year, everybody goes home with a big bonus, whereas the nonprofit has to invest a really good year back into the mission. They can, it's a common misconception that like nonprofits are supposed to zero out on the year. That's not actually true. You can have a surplus, you can carry money over into the next year. You just have to put that money back into your programs and your operations and use it for, like, according to the way that it came in, the stipulations for how it came in. So a 501c3 is just a national designation of nonprofit. So you could be a nonprofit business and not be a 501c3, but a 501c3 is an IRS designation that you apply for. And in order to do that, you're going to need a lawyer. You're going to have LegalZoom online offers nonprofit stuff. Has anybody ever done a nonprofit through LegalZoom? Do we recommend that? I'm not sure. I think it's maybe, you might want to actually talk to a person, but so that's just a very quick overview. All of this information, it's out there. Like there's good information online. This is just to kind of do a really kind of glancing along definitions. Okay, do you think?
Go ahead.
So why do people choose to become nonprofits? And this is something that people choose to do often when they've been doing a personal project for a long time and it's gaining in popularity or it's gaining in capacity. And there's often a lot of question, like in the community will come up, like, are you going to become a nonprofit? And there's pros and cons to that. Why people do it, the main reason in my experience that people become a nonprofit is so that they can qualify to apply for grants. And that allows you to have a funding stream that can really build capacity really quickly. I know, I see like Willow is out there in the audience. Willow just went through this pretty recently. Would you say that was applying for grants the main reason that you chose to go for like a formal nonprofit with the bakery?
Yes, sure. A couple reasons, but that was the biggest one. And after like 5+ years of programming history, we were like positioned very well to fall into larger categories that if I had done when we started up, we wouldn't have been eligible, so it would have been limited. But also, we did not use LegalZoom nor a lawyer.
Ooh, did you do it yourself?
We did.
Would you recommend that?
In retrospect, yes.
It's, I mean, you know,
If you can apply for a grant, if you can apply to the city, the county, or the state of Georgia, you can apply for it.
well, you say that as though that's real easy. And
Well, you're gonna need to be able to do that
I mean, and I think that when we think about like, why do people choose to become nonprofits? What does it offer? There's a lot of pros and cons. It offers access to all of the things, the benefits that come from that designation, but it does mean now you're doing bureaucratic work. Now you have to, there are requirements such as you have to have a board. So who's going to be on your board? It's okay for it to be like your parents at first, but eventually you want that board to grow. I joined a board that was in the midst of transitioning from like our board members are our parents to our board members are real like people in my community. And it was a cute time to be involved with an organization, you know, like they were graduating, so to speak. But you know, you do have to start managing your finances with preparation to be transparent about them. And we're going to get into some of the juicier parts here in a second. So the drawbacks are, you know, office work. You've got to be on top of your business. And you're also sort of committing to longevity. It's once you become a nonprofit and you go through the effort to do that, you're projecting out into the future and saying, you know, we're going to, you know, stick around for a little while, hopefully. So the ways that nonprofits fund themselves fall into some like broad categories, and those categories are grants. We will unpack grants in a moment. Individual donors, that's all of us. That's people in the community, whether it's through grassroots fundraising, whether it's a Facebook fundraiser, or cultivating a significant donor over a period of time who's really invested in your mission and wants to support you in a really meaningful capacity. Everything from the people that give $10 to the people who give $10,000, those are your individual donors. And in communities like Atlanta, I just want to sort of, as an aside, mention that a lot of times you don't have to give a whole lot to be one of the biggest individual donors a small nonprofit has. You know, a few years ago, and this is just a personal anecdote, a few years ago I donated a fee for doing some curatorial juror work back to the organization that had brought me on. And it wasn't an exorbitant fee. It was like, I think it was like a $500 or $600 fee. And when I donated it back to that organization, I became one of their highest level donors of that year. And it was weird because I showed up and was getting this VIP treatment at the like next opening. And I was like, what? I'm not a VIP, like, why am I getting a VIP? And they were like, no, you're like our second highest donor for the year because you donated that fee back to us. And so a lot of times I think people in the community will think like, oh, donors is like people who can write a big check. But really, sometimes it's medium-sized checks or giving kind of at the level that you can. It's really meaningful and makes sometimes bigger impact than you would ever guess. Corporate sponsors. This was a bigger thing in the past. It's something that I think people think is still out there in a way that it isn't really. But it does happen, and we have corporate sponsors for this program. South State Bank and Aprio. Shout out South State Bank and Aprio. But you know, there's historically been periods where corporate sponsorship of the arts was much more robust than it is right now. And it may come back around. It's just that we're in a period where that's not, especially for like small and medium-sized arts nonprofits, that's not as much of a thing as it used to be. But it is out there. And for large nonprofits that have extremely high profile and very large audience reach, corporate sponsorship still is a thing. There's also generated revenue. We used to sell a magazine. And that was generated revenue. In theory, it was money that was being earned through goods sold. Did it ever pay for itself? No, never once. But that's true of a lot of publishing initiatives. And so Generating revenue can be selling merch. It can be ticket sales. It can be, I don't know, merch, ticket sales, magazines, that's it. No, there are other things. But anything where you charge the public at a point of purchase counts. And then fundraising events. And that can mean little things. It can mean a lemonade stand, or it can mean an extremely large gala, or an auction. Art Papers used to do a little auction. I don't know if any of y'all ever attended that, but it was a little party we used to throw. You know, those have overhead, and those have costs, you know, in terms of staff time. Of course, subtext, all of this has cost in terms of staff time, and especially, but also usually overhead too. And so those are the kind of the buckets. Let's talk about the grant bucket. So grants fall into a few different categories. And now there are grants that are going to fall outside of these. They do exist, but these are like the big buckets. Government grants, that's city, county, state, and federal. These are often the most challenging in terms of the bureaucratic process to apply for. They have sometimes shifting requirements and timelines. You have to kind of stay on top of it. They also, because they are public funds, and so they are accountable differently to how they give those grants out, they are taking care of their requirements by kind of passing them down the line to the organizations that apply for them. So their transparency becomes a requirement of your transparency if you follow. So city is like OCA, the Office of Cultural Affairs, also funding us. That's an example of city. Fulton County would be our county, the county we're in right now. Georgia State has some funding for the arts. Keep looking at Anne's face. And of course, federal would be the National Endowment for the Arts. So foundation grants are private foundation grants are kind of a different creature. These are foundations that can be funded by an individual. They can be funded by a corporation can have a foundation. They can be founded by the estate of an artist. So like the Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts is Andy Warhol's, is attached to Andy Warhol's artist estate. They can be kind of conglomerates of different interests that have come together to form a foundation that funds with a particular remit, right? So foundations are going to be interested in certain things, and they'll tell you what they are. They'll say, we're interested in funding convenings, such as this, or we're interested in funding, you know, outreach to children in a specific region. You know, they can be extremely specific, or they can be really, really broad. Like, we just fund innovation in this cultural sector. And what does that mean? So it can be granular, or it can be kind of zoomed out philosophical. Donor advised funds are a kind of related kind of assimilation of a group of donors who are kind of collectively pooling their funding capacity together, and then have some input about the scope and the range of what gets funded. And they can structure how they adjudicate who gets those grants differently. But they have some input into what that space is. Community foundations. Where's Karanda?
I think she might be manning her.
Oh, Karanda's at the table. Karanda was going to chime in for community foundations because Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta is an example. And they're similar. They're kind of similar to a donor advised fund. I'm not going to get down into the granular details, but it is another thing to look out for. So then there's micro granting. Idea Capital is going to be talking later today. They are kind of a crowdsourced, a nonprofit of their own that raises funds to give out microgrants. And those microgrants can be an artist that wants to buy a sewing machine, but can't afford it. Like a nice sewing machine. You know, or a single project that an artist wants to realize. And maybe $1,000 is the difference, you know, or $500, or, you know, $1,500. Like, these are small grants that can make huge impact, especially for emerging artists and individuals, or kind of upstart institutional practices. And then there's regranting. Regranting is something that actually Atlanta Contemporary does through the Warhol Foundation. The Nexus Fund, which Atlanta Contemporary does, is a regranting program through the Warhol Foundation. And so that's when a big foundation that's maybe up in New York, say, wants to get involved in an arena where they don't necessarily have like boots on the ground. And they can reach out to an organization and say, we want to provide funding that you administer to your community because you know your community better than we do. That's often like kind of the idea behind regranting. That is just a way to kind of make more informed decisions in contexts where the funding body doesn't have like a lot of knowledge. So one of the things that came up in our steering committee was wanting to talk a little bit about how nonprofit budgets work, because those of us working in nonprofits recognize that we encounter some misconceptions frequently. And so the metaphor we've chosen to go with here is a garden of uncertainty. And here's a garden plot. So thinking back to that slide that was like grants and individual donors and loanees. So all of these different funding streams have different criteria for how you can apply them. None more so than grants. So, you know when you're on social media and you see a nonprofit that you know and love announce that they've just gotten a big grant? Have y'all seen that before? Sometimes the perception is like, oh man, they just got a bunch of extra money. And that is something that everyone in the steering committee agreed that we wanted to myth bust. Because the way that building a nonprofit budget works is that you're basically making your garden plot. You're getting your seeds, and you're betting on that you're going to be able to water all of those plots. And that all of those seeds are going to grow into, this is Noah also came up with this metaphor, by the way. Give it up for Noah. So you say, okay, I'm going to plant tomatoes, I'm going to plant potatoes, I'm going to plant kale, I'm going to plant cucumbers, I'm going to plant, what else? Gardeners?
Okra. Corn.
Okra, yes, corn. Yes, those corn thirsty. So you're going to need a lot of water for the corn, you're going to need a lot of water for the cucumbers. So in this metaphor, these things are programs, like so this program, for example, or a concert series, or an exhibition, or an educational program. Those are all the things that you're planning to do. And you write the grants in the hope that you get the money that is your water, so that you'll be able to water those different plants. But some grants won't let you water your cucumbers with their water. That grant only lets you water the corn and the potatoes. So if let's say potatoes is like your operating. So operating pays for your rent. It pays for your staff. It pays for your staff's health care. It pays for your phone, your internet, all of the things that make you able to do the programs. But oftentimes, grants really specifically only fund like the flower garden and the okra. And so, you have to kind of, I think of it sort of like you're betting on how much water you're going to be able to get. And that the water that you're going to be able to get is going to be allowed to be used to water all of the garden. You have to have water for the whole garden. Yes, cracking up. And so, and that's something that I think a lot of people going into nonprofit fundraising don't always know, right? That like, oh, okay, we may get this grant, but this grant is only gonna pay for certain things. So we have to figure out how to raise money to pay for the things that the grants don't cover. And that's where individual donors, that's where fundraising events and earned revenue comes in, because that's money that you can usually spend kind of however you want. Sometimes individual donors will stipulate where their money is going to go, and that's wonderful. But often they'll kind of donate to the whole cause, and you can put that money toward the whole garden. You can water wherever is looking a little parched. And so, so that's kind of our quick and rocky overview of nonprofit life. We didn't get into boards too much. We have board members in the board. But there are lots of other aspects. This is a very zoomed out view, right? But so some other terms that are going to come up over the next talks are self-funded. That's a little self-explanatory, but it can mean a lot of different things. Self-funded can mean that a person is spending only their own personal money on doing a project. Sometimes people refer to these as like vanity projects, but I think that's a little mean-spirited. Often, they're very generous projects that are just being funded by a person's own piggy bank. Sometimes it means they're not an official nonprofit, they're not incorporated in any way, but they are getting money from other people or other sources. There's a lot of different ways to kind of like crack the nut of a self-funded project. It can be a very case-by-case thing. But some examples of self-funded projects that, are in this community that you may know about, like day and night projects. Anybody ever been to day and night? That's a self-funded project. They just kind of make it work on their own, figuring it out. And it pays for itself, maybe, but they just love doing it. And sometimes, it's just a thing I'm doing. And that's also okay. Sometimes it's just a thing I'm doing is enough, And then we may also come up, something you may hear talk about is a fiscal sponsor. A fiscal sponsor is a nonprofit organization that agrees to lend its nonprofit status to a project that is not that does not have nonprofit status yet. And so, like, some organizations do this a lot. Like one organization that does that a lot is Alternate Roots. They are a fiscal sponsor for a lot of smaller projects, and there are others. But that's a term that may come up, especially in the support models conversation, that that's a little bit obscure. So why choose to be self-funded? Why choose? What does it offer? What are the drawbacks? The drawbacks are you have to have a fiscal sponsor if you want to, fundraise through grants that are nonprofit specific. The drawbacks are you're taking on you're taking on the financial burden and risk yourself, or you and a group of friends perhaps are doing that. But what it offers is a lot of freedom and not much accountability to what you do. You can pivot, you can change your mind, you can do it for a while and then stop doing it for a while and then pick it back up again. It's your project. And that's got a lot of benefit to it if you're doing something that you want to be able to be really responsive, or that you want to keep small. It's like so much knowledge packed out. I'm not even using these cheat sheets. I guess I'm just winging it. But yeah, so sometimes people choose to just stay self-funded and to grow their project. And we're going to hear at the end of tomorrow a kind of case study from Fals Cabra and Itzhak Burdick, who are coming down from New York to talk about Brief Histories, which is a self-funded project. It doesn't mean they have a ton of money that they are just dumping into it, because they don't. But Fals and Itzhak are going to talk about how they've made a self-funded project work with with a space in New York. And also, it's also a small arts project press. And so they'll talk more about why choose this. And then there are for-profit businesses and LLCs, and that is an option. Often, if you can make it work as a nonprofit, you might be able to make it work as a for-profit. And sometimes organizations that you think of as being nonprofits have, at one time or another, flip-flopped. One of our peer publications, Carla, which stands for Contemporary Art Review of Los Angeles, they just recently, they were for-profit and then switched to nonprofit, and then other peer publications of ours have done the opposite. And so in publishing, I mean, to some extent, this is people just trying to figure out what's going to work. But sometimes there's a natural inclination to think, oh, if this is an arts thing and it is for the public good, it wouldn't work as a for-profit. Sometimes it would. And within that is hybrid models, which later on today, Amanda Norris is going to talk about the bakery and the supermarket, which is a local example of a hybrid model where there's a for-profit business with a nonprofit nesting kind of within it, and they are conjoined and they support each other. It's a really interesting model. It's one that you don't see very often, but I'm personally really into it as a way to grow an institution. And then there's nesting, which is not a technical term, but is a term that I would use just for things that are like part of a university, for example. A university museum, they can raise funds, they can apply for grants on their own with the approval and support of the university that houses them. But they also usually kind of have an umbilical cord of funding that's coming from their department or from the university. And then LLCs are good for individuals who are working in a project capacity where they want to have limited liability. So, if you want to be able to have some protections, some legal protections of being a business, that's a good way to go. And there are some people who are going to be on these panels that are operating in an LLC capacity. So why choose these? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, because those are a lot of different things. But one reason to choose things like a hybrid model or a nesting model is that you can have security. You can have a little bit more shelter from the storm because you're part of something larger. And but one of the drawbacks is they're tied to something. So like university galleries, tied to university funding and tied to university administrations. And they're shifting priorities. The hybrid model works well as long as the for-profit business is functioning. And you can get it, like one drawback is that you can have sort of two sets of potential problems. Like you've got two sets of potential wonderful benefits, but also you've got two things to manage. And I was like, yes. So one of the subtexts of this series is that, we hope that it will be informative for people who are thinking about starting something, or who would consider starting something, or maybe have a fantasy of starting something and want to know if that fantasy is crazy. And so some considerations to keep in mind as you hear people talking throughout the weekend, if you're coming for the whole weekend, which we hope you will, are what do you want to be responsible to? Who do you want to be responsible to? Being a nonprofit means that you're responsible not only to your audiences, but to your funders. And that can mean grant reporting. It can mean being accountable to individual donors who have expectations of how you're going to use the money that they've given to you. It's being accountable to your board, to, if you have staff, it's being accountable to your staff. And recognizing that at a certain point, you're also tied to their livelihoods and their well-being. And so, you know, that's a lot of responsibility. A self-funded project or, you know, might be a way to sidestep some of that responsibility, but then you take on the responsibility of being the sole kind of runner. What relationships do you want to invest in? And that's one that, you know, plays out in a lot of different ways, depending on what kind of organization you're doing, what kind of project. And I think that that's going to be kind of a subtext of a lot of conversations that are going to be had. What's your ideal scale? Do you want to get big? Do you have like dreams of a big institution? Or is it really important to you to stay small? How stable versus how adaptable and agile do you want to be? You know, stability does come often at the expense of that ability to pivot or adjust or reconsider what you're doing. And what restrictions can you accommodate? And that's, again, are you up for what it takes to adhere to the restrictions that nonprofits or that for-profits have? I mean, sometimes, I think, you know, the for-profit restrictions are prioritizing profit. And one of the things that I know from my experience draws people to the nonprofit space is wanting to be able to prioritize other things. Of course, the catch-22 is that you still have to prioritize being able to pay the bills, function. You know, you still have to, like, revenue is still a constant preoccupation, but you can ask different questions about how that revenue happens. And you can pursue it in ways that are not necessarily like following the logics of profit to mixed results. And what reporting can you provide? And so these are sort of some subtext questions that if you are thinking about starting something, I think will play out in the talks to come. So does anybody have any questions about all of this?
And second.
Question about the board. You said you weren't going to talk about the board of directors now, or?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't have a slide dedicated to boards,
I have a question.
but we can talk about it.
Would they be considered, my understanding is that nonprofits, board members raise funds. Would they be considered a source of funding?
Yes, and I guess I kind of lump them under individual donors. But not all boards are designed to be kind of high donor boards. Some boards are really prioritize people who can write big checks and who provide, you know, who have business acumen and expertise that guides the organization and helps navigate problems that come up. But mainly their contribution is that guidance and that fundraising. And then you have boards that, and a lot of young organizations and small organizations have board models where they don't necessarily write big checks, but they work. They show up, they work at the bar, they take tickets. They, you know, they're a volunteer group that also provides guidance and support. And then there's everything in between. And most mid-sized arts organizations, like Art Papers and like, you know, Atlanta Contemporary, they have a mix. You know, they'll have people on the board that really have the capacity to donate, you know, make meaningful, like substantive donations to the organization's bottom line. And then they'll have some people on the board who maybe are artists and their contribution is, you know, the donation of an artwork or the design of a fundraising initiative. And so, you know, and what we ask of our board is that they make a financial donation that is substantial for them, that is one of the top 3 that they will make in the year. We don't even ask to be at the top. And so, you know, whatever that means to them. You know, we have, you know, board members that donate $300 a year, and we have done good board members that donate more than that. And so really, you know, it's a sliding scale, depending on the needs of the organization.
And do the self-funding organizations, are they required to have a board?
No, if you're funding it yourself, you do what you want.
Doing it?
Yeah. I mean, you may choose to invite an advisory board to help you make decisions, especially if the project that you're doing relates to something that feels like a community property. You know, like if you're doing something that is, I think it's a good idea to have an advisory board. But if it's self-funded, that's one of the benefits of it being self-funded, is that you're not really beholden to any structure.
Yeah.
Anybody, I mean, we can also keep talking about boards more if you want. Okay, you went up first.
I have another question about boards. Do you think that you've seen a shift in responsibilities and the structure of boards based on generational differences?
I mean, I think that I don't know if I would map it onto generational differences as much as cultural change. And I can only speak from my own experience. But yeah, I mean, I think that when you have a multi-generational board, you have people at different stages, and they have different capacities and different reasons for being on the board. You know, the older generations of folks on boards maybe have more capital accrued and are maybe more the big check writers. They also have more professional experience and are probably, you know, folks that you would lean on in that way, whereas the younger folks often are still building their wealth, but have time to give and are interested in being really active and visible and learning. And so their type of engagement is inherently different. Often older generations, you know, have been on more boards, and so they kind of know the drill. And, you know, and so, but in terms of like, I think that it's complex. I think that the conditions of wealth have changed. And I mean, if you're thinking specifically about like boards' capacities to give financially, I think that, you know, there will always be folks in big, you know, on the boards of big institutions writing big checks. I think that like small organizations, you know, more grassroots nonprofits, need to really think about what they need in a board and make sure that they're really communicating to the people that they bring into the board space what their expectations and needs are. Because whether or not it's generational or whether it's just economic realities, you know, everybody wants to go in knowing that what they're trying to give is what you need. And so I think communication can overcome any of those differences in expectations or in what they want to offer. Green hat fellow.
Hi, what are the things the board should consider to hold a nonprofit accountable, and what are ways to like confirm your mission? Is it based on like the frequency at which you like provide an offering, or is it like the quality of the offering you're providing?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the, and there are rules for this, you know, that can be Googled. And so, and I won't pretend to be able to like verbatim give it to you. But one of the most important ways that a board can hold its institution accountable is through the financial side, through making sure that the budgets are logical, reasonable, and not approving something that they don't understand. You know, really looking at the materials that are provided and asking questions about them. And that's not to say interrogate your institution. It's just to say be actively engaged in that financial conversation about where is the money coming from, where are the weak points, where are the sure thing moments where we know this money will come, and how are we going to adapt if things happen differently. Another way that boards play a really pivotal role is for institutions when they go through instability with their staff. You know, staff turnover is a really vulnerable time if you are an institution that has staff, and that's a time when the board has to step in and be the leaders that kind of hold, you know, that bridge that gap, the glue that holds the rift together. And that's a way of making sure that the institution is bigger than just the people that make it up. And so, I mean, that's a little different from the accountability thing, but I think it's a really crucial role that boards play. And then what was the second part of the question?
It was a different question. What are ways to confirm your mission? Like, is it like the frequency that you like offer something? Like, for example, if you're not a for-profit gallery, is it how often you do have exhibitions, or is it the like quality of the exhibition? Not to like say like some are better than others.
Well, I think it depends on the mission. You know, I mean, if I don't think that. So the mission is kind of like, you know, mission statements. And if you go and you read them, everybody's got them on their website. You can go, you can read it. They can look a lot of different ways. Some missions are like 400 words. Some missions are a sentence. You know, they can be really detailed, or they can, and I mean, similar to the grant, the foundation grants. There can be like a really zoomed out philosophy, or there can be a very specific granular intervention. And so, I mean, sometimes in nonprofit like world, you hear like the term mission creep, which is, you know, a tendency for organizations to kind of like stray afield over time from their core mission. But really the way that you stick with your mission is that you call your shot. You say, it's not how many you do or what you do, what the quality is, it's you say what you're going to do. And then you do that, or you strive to do that. You know, and that's, you know, you buy your seeds, you plant your plots, and you say, these plots are what we're going to do, what we're going to plant, because we're planting this kind of garden. To go back to the garden metaphor. You know, the kind of garden that you want to plant is your mission. You know, like, we're going to plant a leafy winter greens garden, and that is what we do. And so you plan everything that you do around making sure that you're going to have everything you need to plant your kale and your collards and the mustard greens, and, you know, like, and your lettuce, and, you know, like, you plan around that, and you get, you know, you specialize in that. You learn more about leafy greens by doing that. And, you know, I mean, hopefully through like the vigilance and passion and commitment and dedication and diligence of the people on the board and working for the organization, you move that mission forward while staying true to it. And sometimes institutions reevaluate their mission, you know, at a certain point, saying, you know, we're coming to our 20-year anniversary, we're going to reevaluate our mission. It's a big deal to do that, and you gotta be careful, but it is a thing that sometimes organizations do.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Lauren Tate Baeza, you have a question for me? I've just been watching you back there.
I have a question about grants.
Yes.
So I worked for the last 15 years for a range of nonprofit organizations in lots of different states. And I feel like I have worked on projects where you are laboring for months and months and months to get a grant for $7,000. And you're thinking, you need to do the math, like, is the labor that we spend on this, the hourly, like, pay them staff, like, is that actually more than the $7,000? Like, is this worth the effort? And so negative is my experience with grants. Like, I really kind of disregard them. And so to fund a lot of my individual projects over the years, I tend to lean more on corporate sponsorships, nonprofit to nonprofit partnership was an issue here.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
And yeah, share resource. And then thirdly, in certain certain situations where applicable, I always try to use individual giving. She did talk about especially strategic individual giving, where people are, yes, maybe incentivized by the mission, but also incentivized by the opportunity for a large tax credit to support the mission. So those three things have become really efficient, using the word efficient on purpose, and very beloved by me personally. And so grant writing is not only, again, falling low on the list, it's falling off for me. They can argue with grant writing. Like, can you tell us about like what some of the merits are, or in what context you think grant writing is really effective?
Yeah.
And maybe more personally, your work that you're doing now, Sarah, can you tell us how you stack on the board, you know, relatively other sources, unbasic, how do you should do grant writing relatively other sources?
Yes.
Thanks.
Excellent question.
Sarah Lynn Higgins.
And I mean, and I want to take a moment also here, kind of as we are winding down this little preamble to our talk series, to say, you know, I'm sitting up here because I work at Art Papers, and Art Papers is presenting this program, and I've worked in the nonprofit sector almost exclusively in my life, and you know, but what I know has just come from my experience. Out here in this audience and in this community, there's a wealth of people that know so much about this. And that's not to say hit them up for free brain picking, but it is to say that like people in your community know this stuff. You know, it's esoteric knowledge to some extent, but it's not unknown knowledge. We in this community have a whole lot of experts in the field. And one of them is Lorente Bidenza. Thank you for that question. So, okay, where do I place grant writing? Make an argument for grant writing. Grants, a large grant can be absolutely transformative. You know, the little grants, they are a lot of work for a couple $1,000s, for a few $1,000s. And those governmental grants that I mentioned are often the most work for the smallest grant. But it adds up. And if you have the capacity to have somebody on your staff or on your team, or if you are just into this, and some people are just into grant writing, there's a couple of benefits. The little ones can add up, the big ones can change your organization. They can be multi-year grants, and sometimes with the big foundation grants, you don't just get a check, you get a partner. You get a support team. You get a liaison, and you get guidance. You get folks that you can hit up and say, there was a hurricane that delayed this entire situation. We had to reschedule, or it's impacting things. Help us. And they can either channel more funds to you, they can draw on their partnerships to support you. A good private foundation grant from somebody like Mellon or Wagner or Tiger or Warhol's a little okay at this, but there are big foundations that are excellent at providing lots of support, and that's really valuable too. And an infusion of $175,000, which is the biggest grant that we got for the Fire Ecology Project, it's dispersed over 2 years, that can pay your staff. I mean, you can't use it to pay your staff, but but that can make it doable. That can make you be able to say okay, we've still got gaps to close. We still have to cobble together other stuff, but now it's feasible to do it. And here's a kind of sidebar. One thing that can be really good about grant writing is that it forces you to get your plan in order. It forces you to get your language together. It forces you, and if you are learning, if you are in the stage where you're learning what it is, what shape you want your thing to take, writing grants can really teach you how to hone that, how to communicate it, how to find your words. And it can force you to learn how to plan a program. if that's something that you're new at. Because they'll ask you for all that stuff, and you have to give it to them, so you have to just figure it out. And you will figure it out, and you do. And sometimes you don't get the grant, but it still forced you to figure out the stuff. And so then the stuff is figured out. And that is a kind of benefit of its own. Look at
I was just gonna say that locally, I feel like some of our government grants over time have been small, but I personally feel like they're really important to apply to, because if no one applies, we cannot make the case for more funding. So the only way the amount of money given from city, county, state is ever gonna grow is if enough people apply and those officials can make the case that they are not allocating enough to support the potential cultural community that's here. And so it is a lot of time spent, but I would say it's a really easy way for staff to invest in the broader community.
That's true. That's a great point. And also, sometimes you're doing a project where the size, the scale of grant that you can get from those municipal funds is what you need.
And they have gotten bigger. I mean, I know we're taking the downside, but you know,
Well,
they used to be like $2,500.
yeah.
And now it's a minimum thing. I mean,
I mean, Mark Zay?
One thing I would say about these larger grants is that they can allow you to scale up your mission in a way that these individual grants can't. You know, our top 3 grants are probably 50, 75, over, 120 grants, something like that. And the 3 of them together are equal to every other grant we've ever received in the last few years. So I feel like they give us the opportunity to say, hey, if you're going to do the work for one grant, you might as well do work for a few more because it scales.
Well, also, once you
exponentially.
get your grant language together, you're really just kind of retrofitting it for different things. But, that's also, Mark's saying, board treasurer for art papers. But yeah, I mean, you gotta just kind of find what works for you. I mean, some people get really into grant writing because they're good at it and they get good returns on it and they really get into that headspace. And some people hate it and it's just like, it burns. And they just are like, this is not how I want to do it. And that's fair. I mean, and some people are really good at getting grants and then they're really bad at reporting for grants. Because that is the other thing. Grants require that you report back to them how you spend their money and show proof that you spent it on what they told you to spend on. And so, it's one way of doing it. And some people really thrive in that space and others find it cumbersome and problematic. And often there's kind of a mix. Anything else? Any other questions? This has been fun. We were sort of the whole idea with this sort of preface to these programs was just to kind of invite people in to say, we don't want to be jargony when we talk about these ideas about things that are happening in Atlanta's arts ecosystem. But we also, some of these are terms that we just need to be able to use, and we wanted to kind of invite people in to have a conversation about them. Does anybody have any terms that were up there on the board or that we talked about that you would like us to unpack any more? No? Thank you guys for participating in this and asking so many questions and stuff. Again, since people have come in over the course of this, I want to refer you all to pick up your copy of this of the Atlanta Art Ecosystem zine. It has the full schedule of all the talks that are going to be coming up today and tomorrow, and it also has a resource guide of visual arts resources here in Atlanta, and they're free. You can put at the table up front, and we will be back at 1 o'clock. Lunch break, everyone. Oh, also, if you want to get lunch nearby, Atlanta Contemporary has some really cute little lunch, like food walking distance from here. Little pieces of paper. We have some at the table and some up by the lake. There's anyone advice about a place to grab food.